Hi, I'm Diamond Duggal. I'm a music producer. I have a band, Swami, and I'm currently mixing and recording the new album. So I'm going to give a bit of an insight into how I'm going about actually doing the recording and the mixing of it. I tend to record the drums starting with my Akai MPC 3000 drum machine. I'll program the beat on the machine itself, and then I will take the separate outputs of the bass drum, the snare drum, the hi-hats and the toms, and record them onto separate tracks within Pro Tools. What I tend to do once I have the drums recorded on separate tracks in Pro Tools is I get a rough balance of the drums with the faders, and then I tend to look at the bass drum if it needs a bit of top end or a bit of compression to sit better with the other drums. The snare might need a bit of brightening. I don't tend to compress any other of the drums. I don't compress the hi-hats. I don't compress the toms. Sometimes the toms I may compress them because they can be a bit boomy unless they're kept under control, and I tend to take some EQ off the low end at the toms. What I would tend to do is have all these drums and I would group them together and feed them into one stereo auxiliary input, and that would allow me to compress them all together and to get them to gel together as more of a tight drum groove. So let me make a new track, one stereo auxiliary input. There we go. What I need to do is I need to feed this auxiliary input with all the drums. So I'll set the auxiliary input to receive a bus input that I'm not using. Let's go for bus 7 and 8. And then I'm going to send all of my drums to bus 7 and 8. That will make it go to this auxiliary input. There we go, and now if I solo the auxiliary input, there it is. So now as you can see, I've got a stereo control over the whole of the drum mix. I can still change the levels individually here of the hi-hats, or the bass drum and snare drum. But what I'm going to do here is add a multi-band compressor. And the reason why I use a multi-band compressor, because it can separate separate frequencies within the whole sound of the drums and compress them differently and separately and by different amounts and different ratios. If I use a straight up traditional limiter or compressor, I tend to find that when the kick drum is pumping up, the hi-hat will drop too far down in level, and the drums tend to sound a bit too squishy, squashy, like listening to an AM radio or something. I want the drums to maintain the roundness and the fullness of the sound with the same levels of the hi-hat and the kick drum relative to each other, but with a lot more oomph, and the multi-band compressor allows me to do that. As you can see immediately, that's allowing the drums to sit tighter within themselves, and I've got more control over the frequencies, the bottom end of the actual drum groove, to let it sit a bit tighter. I think the snare drum needs a little bit more bite, so what I will do is add an EQ, 4-band EQ in Pro Tools. And what I tend to do is, if I want the snare drum to have a bit more bite, is look for a frequency by turning the gain up in the mid-range. Oh, not that one, it's going to be this one here. As you can see, that's really pumping through on a certain frequency. Then I choose the frequency where I want it to push through in the sound, say around there, and then back off the gain. That way I can hear the resonance of the drum and the way I want it to push through the song. Let's narrow the cue a bit so the range of the frequency is less. Hear it with and without. A bit flat, a bit more push. With the kick drum, I tend to roll off the very low frequencies. I don't want any 20 Hertz, 30 Hertz, even 40 Hertz. If the kick drum starts losing a bit of its oomph, then I will maybe take it back down to 30. With the snare, I tend to roll off everything under 100 by rule of thumb. I might even push it up to 150 Hertz. I don't want to hear those frequencies from a snare drum. Toms can be problematic. I tend to find that they can ring all over the place on the low end, so I tend to cut those off as well, generally around 100 Hertz. And obviously with hi-hats, you can cut off any frequencies below 300, 400 Hertz. And I find that tends to clean the drum track up considerably in the way the drums sit together as a whole unit. With a big sample library to choose from, I tend to try and find the right sound I want in the track. I'll look for the right kick drum, I'll look for the right snare drum sound. If it's not working on the track and I'm having to EQ too much, I'll just go back into my sample library and look for a different sound. If I really think that I can work with the sound that I've got, I maybe boost a little bit of 3K on the snare drum. I may even roll the gain right up in the mid-range on the snare drum and try and select a frequency, anything between 800 Hertz all the way around up to 3K, to find something that's going to slap in the mix and then back off the gain just to a point where it's going to sit nicely. And with the kick drum, I might just add a bit of top end or a little bite around the middle, say around 600 Hertz. But other than that, I tend not to try and EQ my drums too much these days. Well, I hope you found that useful, the way I work with my drums for making the beat sound fat.